Hello, everybody, and welcome to UTS Business School. My name's Rhodes, and I am Dean of the school here. We will begin by acknowledging that we're on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay respects to the elders past and present. I think we're here to talk about history, and I think Australian history as it relates to First Nations people is one that is filled with omissions, absences, and outright lies. And I think we should remember that as we talk about, as we start here in this discussion. So the reason we're here today is to talk about this book, Australian Economic History, Transformations of an Interdisciplinary Field, by Claire Wright, who, as you know, is sitting right here. Claire is a business historian here at UTS Business School, and she's interested in how interpersonal connections affect knowledge, markets, and business strategy, focusing especially on Australian corporate networks and diversity in leadership. As well as being the author of this book, Claire is an Australia Research Council Discovery Early Grant researcher, an impressive and prestigious award that she started in 2002 and will continue into 2004. And through that project is working on the very first history of Australia's corporate women across the 20th and early 21st century. Great to talk to you today, Claire.
Thank you.
So just introduction, this book, as I said, here, available through all good retailers. Excellent Christmas present. Seriously, it is a fascinating book. I finished reading it on the weekend. You know, the one that's written with a very considered intellectual maturity. It's received very positive reviews. Congratulations, Claire. And it's a book that provides a perspective on economic history, or more particularly the history of economic history in Australia, with a key focus on how this is an interdisciplinary field in the nexus between economics and history. And also, to some extent, woven into the book is how all of this is contextualized in the history of Australian universities themselves, or ourselves. So this offers, a lot to the reader about economic history, but also about the broader exploration of the possibilities for academic research now and in the future. And it's those broader issues, rather than the specifics of the economic history, that we want to talk about today. But just to get us started on that, Claire, can you tell us a little bit about how and why you came to write this book?
Yeah, that's a good question, I think, because it's a little random. So I started off in economic theory, really, and intellectual history, and I was interested in how ideas develop and how people come to certain innovations and things like that. And I started my PhD and I was looking at economic history as a field, not necessarily as the works of great men and women, but as communities of practice. I was interested in networks and I was interested in groups of people and how that affects the sorts of knowledge that is produced. And so then as I moved a little bit further through the work and was writing the book, the lens kind of zoomed outwards a bit, and I wrote it not as great men / women, not as communities, but as the structures and the ways in which universities encourage or discourage certain types of knowledge. So you'll hear me say a lot that no one's going to do it if no one has a job. And I think that that's become more of the central issue here, is that, like, we can say, let's do this sort of knowledge and let's do that sort of knowledge. But if you're not actually have any incentives or structures in place to do it, then people aren't going to. Mm-hmm. So that's, I suppose, how I came to the work. And now, as a practitioner of economic history, it's a very interesting and I think a good internship in how to do economic history in the more specific sense. But also as a university worker, I'm interested in how universities work and the sorts of things that people like you, I suppose, encourage from the top down.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, in relation to that, in the title and throughout the book, you talk a lot about, and I quote here from page 1, you say, interdisciplinary research is advocated as a source of innovation and scientific breakthrough. I mean, not necessarily just advocated by you, but that is advocated. And these days we hear a lot about interdisciplinarity and post-disciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, and all various things. But in terms of, the idea that interdisciplinary research is advocated as a source of innovation, can you elaborate on that a bit for us?
Sure. So we always hear that, we want to produce job-ready graduates and we want to produce knowledge that transcends disciplinary boundaries and knowledge that is useful and practical, and quite often that is interdisciplinary. So the idea that we put knowledge into discrete categories is not really reflected in the world that we're trying to understand. So pandemics, for example, or climate change or economic crises and things aren't necessarily contained within one particular group. They are interdisciplinary. And so governments have recognized this, and universities themselves have recognized that the problems we're trying to solve aren't in disciplines. And so they've said that we want to support this type of knowledge that transcends or connects different disciplinary silos. The problem, I think, is that that's a little bit of lip service, and the policies that universities often introduce don't support what they say that they want.
The ARC still has fields of research codes, does it not?
They do. And, you can put multiple fields of research codes, but you still are defined by, are you history? Are you politics? Are you chemistry, and so on?
So, but does that mean then that interdisciplinarity is a good thing in principle at all times? Is there any downsides that you see, either like in general or just through the practice of your own work?
Yeah, so I think that there's a couple of different things here. The first is that we need disciplines. I'm very pro-discipline. It might not sound like it, but I am, the metaphor I like is, in order to bridge a river, you need to have land on either side to anchor to, right? You need to connect something. And so without disciplines, interdisciplinary research is quite meaningless. And also the work that I do, being an interdisciplinary scholar, draws very deeply on people who are specialists in that area. Like, I'm not doing the super, super deep economics research, but I draw on that in the work that I do. And so there's a real complementarity between different types of knowledge, and interdisciplinary serves a certain function, and disciplines also serve a different function. And I think so there's that piece of it, that we can't just do away with disciplines. But the other, I think, risk for interdisciplinary practitioners and also for, moving forward, is that disciplines are dominant because they're so easy to define. It's because they're so easy to measure and encourage and set up and sort of establish. And interdisciplinary research is defined by its lack of definition. Like, there are porous boundaries, there's uncertainty as to the way forward. It's difficult to know what the right approach is because there are competing, equally valid approaches that are going on. And so that's a real challenge for being a practitioner of interdisciplinary research, but also for knowing how to best support this type of research as well.
Well, that's interesting, because if you think of the idea of a discipline as a general term, not just as an academic discipline, but discipline to all of us, it's about rules. There's a kind of asceticism to it, and doing what you're supposed to do. And, to be self-disciplined means you're kind of in control and you're, living your life by a code. So does that mean with interdisciplinarity, anything goes? All rules out the window?
No, yes and no, right? So I think that, one of the challenges that Australian economic history has faced throughout its history is that there is a real tendency to try and become a discipline. There are lots of really good things about it. You have identity, you have professional practice, you have, all of the ways of doing and sort of agreed sets of rules to things, and professionalism and so on. And that's a really tempting thing. If you are any sort of knowledge worker, you're probably going to want to have that set of identity with your peers, with your colleagues in some fashion. And so the idea that you're going to just kind of accept the uncertainty and everyone's sort of competing best practices are all kind of valid is a very uncomfortable place to live. We demand certainty as humans, and we want certainty. And so it's very difficult to sort of sit in that and go, okay, that person who's leaning more towards economics is good, love them. And the person who's a bit more sort of history based is also good. And there's a tendency in that uncertainty to have conflict, to have fragmentation, and it's a really difficult thing to manage, I think.
Because, I mean, if you think of the disciplines, there are some disciplines, I call them the IST disciplines. And these are the disciplines which have a strong sense of individual identity amongst the people who are in them. Economics is an example. If you're an economist, you're there, that's kind of part of who you are. It's not just what you do, it's who you are. And it's the same if you're a sociologist, it's the same if you're a philosopher. Now, working in an interdisciplinary field, you don't have this sense of identity, right? You're not connected. And if I look even personally at you, if you don't mind, you know, do you think of yourself as an economist? I think you're suggesting not. Do you think yourself as a historian? You're here in a business school, as you document in the book. Economic history departments aren't what they used to be, so there's not really any of them that you can go and join. I mean, how do you identify in terms of finding your place in the academy and literally being here today?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. I can kind of speak to this as both an insider and an outsider. So having observed economic history and economic historians, and also being an economic historian myself. And look, my professional identity, I would say that I'm an economic and business historian. What that means is up to everyone else. But and I've had a lot of really strange career moves. I think economics, history. I worked in a museum, and then I've been in business schools in management. And I think one of the things that's really helped me, particularly around management, is that it's not one of those disciplines, that it is a lot more open. It is a lot more open to different traditions and perspective. It's a lot younger as a discipline, which means it's got more porous boundaries. And so it's quite fine for me to be doing the work that I do within a management school. Would I say I'm a management scholar? In part, I think, but not entirely. Yeah.
I guess that's the whole thing about being interdisciplinary. It's always in part.
Yes, exactly.
In a sense. I mean,
my FOR codes, and I've 50% in this and 30%
yeah,
in that.
although for academic audience, pick your FOR codes based on what you think is going to be most successful, not what you think describes your work the best, which is a whole other thing about the disciplines, right? That some are privileged over others. And as you say, in business schools, most of our work is defined by fields of practice rather than discipline. So management, for example, that's something people do, and then people study it from a different way. But I mean, in relation to that, and as you said before, with your analogy about the banks of the river, the disciplines are still important. You're not proposing a post-disciplinary world. But when you spoke earlier about government and so forth, looking at and looking at transdisciplinarity or interdisciplinarity as a solution, I get the feeling there's a complete lack of respect for the disciplines, and they think that they're kind of unnecessary and stuffy and not relevant. But what other way is there to organize knowledge? No alternative is produced. I mean, do you think this focus on problem solving is helpful in relation to the fact that we still need disciplines?
Yeah, so I think that my perspective, like I mentioned the complementarity between different types of knowledge, and I think what's lacking in the conversation, particularly around research and research funding and even the way that we structure universities, is that there isn't a lot of a sense of treating different types of knowledge along the same plane. It's either, okay, we're doing things according to this thing, we're going to evaluate everything according to this measure of success or this particular criteria or whatever, or we're going to go completely the other way and we're going to, we now live in a post-disciplinary or transdisciplinary world. And I think just kind of recognizing that there are different types of knowledge and that they have different dynamics and they have different characteristics and things like that. And one of the things that's in the book that kind of comes up again and again is the fact that I don't think, I'm maybe one of the first people to actually treat economic history as an interdisciplinary field. Even the people I interviewed were like, yes, this is the discipline, it's this. And universities are like, well, we'll treat it the same as economics, we'll treat it the same as history and whatever. But actually going, no, it's different, it's distinctive, is really important, I think. And going, okay, how is management different to, say, psychology or to chemistry in its characteristics?
Yeah. So I might just turn the discussion now a little bit more to universities, and maybe with a particular reference to business schools where we are when it comes to interdisciplinarity. Now, there are some interesting angles. If you look at the Australia Research Council and you look at their program of Excellence in Research Australia, now obviously that's been all kind of brought into question by the current government. But the era doctrine that we were under, and it's relevant to this history as well, the gold standard, right? If your discipline got rated a 5, it meant you were world leading, which lends itself to a very disciplinary focus on publication to try and achieve that. It means people weren't writing so many books because journal articles were more popular, but very much dominant in business schools as well. And we've got, with the new emphasis now that's kind of emerging in a contested way around impact and engagement and so forth. Do you think this is moving us to a new world of interdisciplinarity? And do you think universities can handle it?
That's a very interesting question. And I think that, so the impact and engagement piece is, I think, really good for interdisciplinary fields. I think I'll say that up the top, that in a world where we want to engage with our industry partners or with government or with the public, knowledge that kind of gets beyond the specialized jargon of disciplines usually performs quite well in that space. It's usually easily translatable and all those sorts of things. So that's, I think, a good thing. And it, as you note, it's juxtaposed against this, like, we want to be world leading, which usually means disciplinary and overseas verified, right? Yeah. So there's two pieces there, the sort of colonial systems of knowledge and way that we sort of see either overseas journals rather than Australian journals, or overseas book imprints rather than Australian book imprints as like more, or more legitimate or more important than other types of outlets. And so, like, the idea of ERA, which is excellence in research in Australia, and as you know, it's up for sort of renegotiation at the moment, and we're kind of engaging in a process of consultation, I suppose. What is it that we're measuring with excellence? That is kind of the key question. And I have, like, I suppose, a less radical and a more radical kind of response to the ERA rebrand.
Let's go with the more radical.
Okay, burn it to the ground. Like, what are we actually measuring here? Like, is excellence just disciplinary, overseas verified knowledge? Is that excellent? Like, what is excellent research? Like, what is excellent knowledge? And I think that that's quite a normative statement that they're trying to sort of shoehorn into a objective, like, measure. And that objective measure is usually citation rates. So the way that we actually rank journals, I went into this in the final chapter of the book, how are journal rankings determined? So the ABDC list, which is the Australian Business Deans Council list, and then things like Scamargo, like journal rankings, like, how do we actually determine them? And you go into their policies and it's mostly citations. And the problem with that is that citations tend to accrue to members of a disciplinary tribe because, you have shared research agenda and you have shared language, and it's more easily able to cite your peers and things. And so the way that we actually understand what is excellent is not really doing what we think it's doing or what it should be doing. So I think that the understanding of trying to measure excellence in a very, standardized way is problematic in itself. And so the other problem, I think, with the ERA assessment or any sort of rankings is that it encourages people to game the system, essentially. Like, we've all heard stories about people like hiring professor on a 0.1 to get the publications for the ERA round, like, not here, stories, not naming names. But we've all heard these stories, and also of, like, moving any interdisciplinary contributions into a different department so they don't kind of drag down the average. Like, these gamifying ERA is a real thing. And so it's not actually encouraging excellence either. It's not measuring excellence and it's not encouraging it. And so despite the fact that it takes an enormous amount of resources for, people like yourself and associate deans of research and professional staff and all these sorts of things. And I'm like, does it actually do anything? And I think no. I just don't think it's a very good way of, like, do we need to monitor excellence in that way? The other thing I think that a history of universities can really give us is the fact that we didn't always have ERA. And we were producing very good knowledge. And, like, we did excellence without defining excellence in that way. And so I think that I have some suggestions around like how we could improve ERA, but my first one is just to like, do we need it? Do we need that at all?
Well, that's under debate at the moment, and will be under debate through the Accord, I believe. I'll just to let you know, I'm old enough to remember the days before ERA, and but that not about me. But as an early career researcher, I mean, the gamification affects in other ways too. Like I know people here who will choose research topics based on their likelihood to be published in elite journals. And that could mean, for example, you have people in this country researching, something that might be happening in the United States. Many fields have a preference for US-based studies and data, which seems in an Australian public university to being effectively given incentives to do that seems quite aberrant. But the incentives are very real, and the incentives are very real also to try and publish in particular journals. So writing a book about Australian economic history, you're bucking all of that, right? You're going against all of that as an early career researcher. I mean, were you aware of, what were your considerations? I mean, congratulations to you for doing it, by the way, and to all respect to that. But how did you think about that?
This goes back to the identity question, and even up until last year, I was interviewing in history departments, and I think that that's the main thing that was happening that prompted the book. One, it was initially produced within a history department, and also I wasn't quite sure which way it was going to go. Was it going to be a business school? Was it going to be a history department? And the problem I think with working in my particular field is that if you're lucky, your parent disciplines just like disagree on where you should submit work. And then if you're unlucky, they disagree on what you should be writing. And this is like, we're unlucky. So history really preferences books. Like you're not really taken seriously unless you have a book. You're probably not going to get a job unless you have a book or at least a book proposal. Whereas in business schools, sometimes you're not taken seriously if you do have a book. It presents a real conundrum for like deciding what to do, especially when it was a little up in the air as to which direction I was going to go in. And so there was a real chance that I would just like not tell anyone about the book.
Well, it's a bit late now. This is being filmed,
Like depending on whatever department I was in or what was going on, there was a real chance that I wouldn't make a big deal out of it or whatever. And it just so happens that this business school happens to be quite amenable to these outlets, and so that makes a big difference. But it's a real thing of like, surely books are important regardless of the discipline that you're working in, because it's a big idea sort of synthesized into one place. And we were talking earlier about how it's a lot more, you're making a big statement and you're kind of collecting, the given wisdom on a particular subject. And yet it's an outlet that's not really valued in a lot of areas because it's not seen as rigorous. And I'll tell you what, they were very rigorous with the review. So I think that the main reason that the book was written was because I didn't really know what I was going to do with my life.
Yeah. Okay. Well, for what it's worth, I think you made some good choices. Now, just on the other side of, some of the possible dangers, again, coming back to this idea of post-disciplinarity and a kind of disrespect for the disciplines that you might have outside of universities, but the disciplines still provide the creaky old scaffolding that kind of holds us together. I mean, if that perishes, is there anything left? I mean, how do we manage to preserve those tensions between disciplinarity and interdisciplinarity?
Yeah, so I can kind of speak to the broad progress of the field here because it does reveal what happens if you go too far one way or the other, right? So in the early 20th century, Australian economic history was characterized by cooperation between government research, university research, and this thing called the Workers' Educational Association, which was kind of a technical college, and also very porous boundaries between disciplines, and people used to move in and out of those three different sorts of institutions and the different disciplines quite well. And it meant that the work produced was very interdisciplinary. There was lots of things happening. There was lots of integration and communication and all of that stuff. But there was just like individuals kind of working on their own without any collaboration. There was no professionalism. There was no discussion between them or like any set agenda. And it was just very amorphous. It was hard to get a sense of what was actually going on, or even if anyone knew of each other or knew each other. And so I think that demonstrates the value of some sort of scaffold. And it's a real like Goldilocks situation. And I think whenever I give advice to people on how do you encourage interdisciplinary research, like what scaffold is important, what scaffold is useful. And this applies to any sort of discipline or field. It's about what's called communicating infrastructures. And these are the things that like bring people into a particular space. So this is a communicating infrastructure, or a conference, or a collaboration, or teaching a course or something, like actually has a structure that brings people into conversation with one another. And you have to think about the constraint of that communicating infrastructure. So if something is very constrained, it means that the people involved are highly connected and highly invested, and you're probably going to have people who are very closely aligned. But if you have lower constraint, it means that there's more porous boundaries, people can move in and out quite easily, and you're probably going to have a bit more diversity in who's involved, just because it's a lot easier to get involved and to do that plus your other work. And so that gives us, I think, a kind of a scaling of different scaffolding. So there is value in having things with high constraint, because that's useful for certain types of activities, or one-on-one collaborations that require that. But then there's also value in things with quite low scaffolding, or like low constraint, I suppose, because that provides a lot more diversity and a lot more openness to different traditions or perspectives.
Okay, so just a little bit more on that. I mean, another danger of interdisciplinarity, on the one hand, you might be considered, the polymath, or the infamous, let's say, Renaissance person, or Renaissance man, as it used to be only men, including in this book, by the way, is very dominated by male academic figures. So you can have this idea of the polymath, but then you have a more pejorative notion of the dilettante, who just goes around picking up things from everywhere. Is that a tension for you in doing this work?
I think so. And I always, you always feel like the grass is greener. And I'm like, okay, well, if I had 3 years and I just became like an expert on this one thing, that's not necessarily my predisposition. And I think that that's not necessarily the role that I play in a community or in a university or whatever. I'm more of a bridge builder, not necessarily the islands. And so I think that you do worry that you're not specialized enough, or that you're not good enough, or that you're not experienced enough in that particular, like, I sort of wander into accounting history and I'm like, that's fine, I can do accounting history. And then you get some reviews back and then you're like, oh, okay, maybe I can't. And you always have these things, but I think that that's also probably true if you're, in any sort of knowledge domain. But there is this risk of, not doing as much sort of specialized work, that you are going to be considered at once both the polymath and also just like a bit of a lightweight, that people are going to be like, okay, she sort of skates over the surface of lots of different things, not necessarily the depth that other work has.
So I still got a couple more questions before we go to the audience, and this is a really important question to me. So based on what we've talked about, based on your book, based on your thoughts about interdisciplinarity, what is your advice to me as Dean of UTS Business School on how we should deal with interdisciplinarity?
Okay, so I have a couple of things. I have two things.
I'm writing notes.
Okay, right here. 2 specific things, one on research, one on teaching, I think. I'll start with the teaching one. So one of the problems that we have with interdisciplinary instruction is basically the way that universities are funded. In the late 80s, we went through the Dawkins reforms and we introduced neoliberal market reforms to higher education. And basically we started treating universities like M-form corporations. For any of the management people here, they'll know what that means. And each unit is pretty much autonomous in terms of a budget, and your budget depends on how many students and how much student revenue you bring in, and so on. And that is very bad for interdisciplinary teaching, because why would the business school let people from outside come and take their courses? Or why would the arts faculty let their students go over to business? Because that means actual concrete dollars and cents. And it used to happen and now it doesn't. So I think that having some sort of and it's a bad thing because an accountant, say, or someone in economics is probably going to go out into the world and then deal with like mergers and acquisitions or like a stock market crash or regulation, and might need information or knowledge from the arts faculty or from the science faculty or whatever it is. And so I think that having a situation where we actually formalize how do we do cross-disciplinary teaching is really important. Like, what can we take some cues from, say, a liberal arts education where we say, okay, you have to do some maths, or you have to do some science, or you have to do at least one course in history or something like that, and have some sort of partnership. Education faculties do this quite well, where they have a partnership sometimes with, say, they do history curriculum or history education for the education faculty, but they partner with someone in the history department. And I think some sort of like revenue sharing, because the money is important. So revenue sharing plus partnership between different faculties for some sort of broader liberal arts education would be like, how great would that be for our business students to go and take a politics subject? We have to go and take a politics subject or something like that. So I think following the money is a really important thing. Yeah. And so that's kind of the teaching suggestion that I would like to see. The other thing is around research. I think the biggest problem that we have with interdisciplinary research is that we don't know how to evaluate it. And it's actually quite hard to evaluate. It's defined by its diversity. It's defined by its porous boundaries. It's difficult to define and identify. And even things like journal rankings, we probably just need to get everyone on the same page, or at least like allow everyone to have a list. So the ABDC list is more or less like important to business schools depending on the policy, but there are other lists as well. And so just a system where, say, the top history journal can be evaluated against the top economics journal would just be so helpful to promotion applications or whatever. So kind of just expanding the measures that we have to evaluate research, not like we've decided this is the list, and if you're not on the list, then that doesn't matter, but actually having multiple measures in which like you can demonstrate excellence or you know, that your contribution has been made and so on. And I think just the biggest thing with kind of recognizing the importance of interdisciplinary research is recognizing that diversity and having measures in place to kind of expand what we can say. Yeah.
And I think, again, following on from that, I think we are at a bit of a juncture at the moment, and the Accord will play this out and possibly, you know, lead to a suite of reforms that we haven't seen since Dawkins, since the 80s. And a lot of this has interdisciplinarity is a part of that, and the focus on impact and engagement, as I mentioned before, are all a part of that. So if you kind of think of more broadly about the current historical position of Australian universities, is the future bright or dim for interdisciplinarity?
Well, look, I think Glyn Davis says I am tough-minded but optimistic. So take that how you will.
I'm not arguing with him. He's in the Prime Minister's office.
Well, yes.
Yeah.
So I think that my nervousness, I think, comes from the fact that we've been saying we want interdisciplinary research for quite a while, and the structures still don't necessarily reflect things, and they don't encourage things. So I think that that's where my tough-mindedness is. I'm like, here's some concrete things that can be done, and whether or not that's being taken on board. I think that some very, like I mentioned before, the revenue structures of universities and how following the money is probably the biggest way to like identify places where things can improve, and also the barriers. Like, this is why we're so stuck on the things we can introduce, because you can say all you want, but if the money doesn't line up with that, it's not going to happen. And so with that, it's hard to say whether or not things can change, because I don't see us like not being a neoliberal university in the next 10 years. And so then, and also I don't necessarily see us being universities that are not interested in professional instruction or frontier research, both of which kind of funnel students and knowledge into silos. So there's a lot of reasons that kind of keep the status quo that I would probably see them as sort of persisting. On the other hand, there are very good things that have happened, particularly around the ARC. Like, I don't think we would be having the conversations about impact and engagement that we would without the ARC actually assessing it. So that's a really good example of where the federal government decided we want to assess applications and grants based on impact and engagement. And that kind of filtered back down to universities and to university workers, and has been a really good thing, I think. And so there are opportunities there to set, again, money, tie money to the thing. And then I think that there's opportunities to change things.
Yeah, and government policy is important. I mean, the neoliberal university, you're right, it is chasing money, and we talk about universities being in competition with one another, and that it's a market, and often that's about internationalization as well. But you know, this isn't the Gough Whitlam era, right, where it was public funding and public access. But on the other hand, the good thing about history is you can't predict it. It's and maybe there will be a different future as well. Do you think that's possible?
And it might be worse, right? Like, we don't know. Like, so, sure, you can't predict it, but it doesn't necessarily get better. And I think that that's a really good point. I think one of the things that makes me optimistic about history is knowing that the things that are unhelpful are not enduring. You know, they have come in at a particular moment in time. And I think that's the value of history in any context, is that we go, okay, these things that have been quite naturalized within the university system, like everyone kind of just accepts that we do era. No one says, do we really need to do that? But going, okay, well, it's only been around for the last 20, 25 years or something like that, goes, okay, well, maybe we don't. So I think that history provides us the tools to go, things can be different, things change, and these things are not forever. They are not immutable sort of institutions.
Which would suggest that it's important to teach history to business students so that they do go out realizing, I mean, it's easy to become institutionalized in the present, right? And to think nothing's ever changed. I remember not long after COVID, I read a student comment during COVID, sorry, where a second year student said, is it really true that they used to hold exams in person and not on Zoom? Right, and so that's how quickly we can just get used to something as the present being the only thing that was. And history, I guess, teaches us that that's not the case, which, if anything, can lead us to believe that change is possible and that we have some agency in doing that, and we're not just, you know, a victim of the present. But I don't know of any business schools that teach business or economic history. Are you aware of any?
Well, I've had some conversations with Peter Szyminski about this, and you know, we'll talk more, but like not very many. And I think that especially for business students, I think that it's very important. I'm biased, but I think it's very important. Particularly, I talk in one of the later chapters about the fact that economic history, at least in some places, has become a little bit more trendy within, say, economic schools, because they went through the global financial crisis and they were like, this is quite similar to the Great Depression. Let's go and look at the Great Depression. Yeah. And so sort of understanding the cycles of things and the way that companies, you know, rise and fall, and the way that the economy changes, the fact that we have a stock market crash every 10 years or so, I think is really valuable training for business students. At the same time, I think that for history students or for arts students in general, like a training in like how corporations operate is really important, because they're major, you know, public institutions that affect the society we live in. So it goes the other way as well.
Okay. Now in a minute, I'm going to turn to the audience, people here and people online, for questions. But just my final question is, what's your next book going to be about?
That's a very good question. As you mentioned at the top, I'm working on Australia's corporate women, and I think something like the anti-lean-in might be workshopped as a title. So like something about corporate women and how corporate women, particularly in Australia, have, you know, replicated a lot of the inequality in, you know, the corporate sector in general, and how they've, you know, drawn on really sort of long-term structures of privilege and how they've worked over time. This is a really good example where we live in the present and we assume that corporate women or women in corporate leadership is a very contemporary thing, like maybe the last 10 years or so. And the work that I've done so far suggests it's a very historical thing.
Excellent. Move over, Sheryl Sandberg.
Yeah, hopefully.
Now, to people here first, any questions you'd like to ask of Claire? Sir.
It's Andrew is here, member of the faculty and management department here, recent I studied at Macquarie University with an arts degree in the late 1980s, and Macquarie had a great tradition of, now that I hear you speak, I think it was probably more multi-discipline rather than interdiscipline, because we were allowed to do things outside of our disciplines in those days, and Macquarie had a great history of that. And I think there's a lot of research into double degrees now in the university sector. And in some respects, it's not that new a thing. People doing arts law, for example. So I wanted you to clarify whether sort of multidisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity are two different things. And then maybe speak to the education piece. Does it require a particular skill to be able to teach truly interdisciplinary to those two students? So the teacher course that sort of, you know, finds a way between politics and law, for example. Somebody can make those two.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I didn't get into the terminology because it can be a bit, you know, but multidisciplinary I would define as something like a double degree where you've got multiple specialists actually kind of coming in with their own perspective, but they're not necessarily talking to one another. So you would have, because a double degree in ostensibly is, you know, you do a law degree and you do an engineering degree at the same time. Like that's how a lot of double degrees are structured. And so I would call that a multidisciplinary effort. And so the person actually gets all of the disciplinary instruction, but they might not know how to bring them together. They don't necessarily know how, say, history and economics work together. And so to your education piece, what would it require for there to be interdisciplinary instruction? And I think I mentioned before, like a partnership, not just going and sending someone to the science faculty to get them to do a thing, but to have, say, science for accountants. That's a weird example, but, you know, like, and have something where there is that integration, where there is an accounting person and a science person, and they work together to sort of bridge that gap, rather than a multidisciplinary, which is like just like less integration, where you go and kind of expose them to that material on its own. Thanks.
We'll go here and then over to you after.
I really don't even know.
No, we need it for the people online. Yeah.
That's fine. On the topic of science for accountants, do you believe that there are limits to interdisciplinarity? History is a really easy one because every field has got a history. But are we looking at the economics of science? Is that an interdisciplinary conversation that we should be having, or is there an irrelevance to that conversation?
Look, I would argue that if you're working for a pharmaceutical company, you're probably going to need to know some economics or accounting, or some, like, if you're commercializing your scientific research in some way, you're probably going to need to know about supply chains or logistics or management or something like that. So I would say that that is, you know, even something that is quite biological, like a pandemic, we know is not entirely biological or STEM based. Like it's very heavily leaning towards, you know, what does the human body do and how does the human body react? But it's also about geography and movement and, you know, politics and things like that as well. So I would say that nothing exists in isolation, and there is the value of, depending on the work that's being done and what that accountant, say, would need to do, they might get value, like, you know, new initiative.
And of course, everything has an accounting dimension to it in this,
Exactly.
in this day and age.
Sorry, anything.
Alice, I think you had your hand up.
Yes, thank you both for that very interesting discussion. Yes, and I'm sort of thinking aloud slightly about, do we actually really have something that is interdisciplinary? Because of course, as you know, I teach a subject which is law for managers. But am I just—
Great job.
Yeah, it's interdisciplinary, but am I just teaching law whilst in the frame of management? You know, am I actually doing something that's interdisciplinary, or am I just looking at, and it's the same sometimes when I write, am I just translating something for and in the structures of the other or is there something actually there in the middle of the bridge? I don't even know, and I kind of work in this area.
This is a great question, because I don't have my graph with me, but there's two stages to interdisciplinarity. The first is the communication stage, so two-way communication. So you probably talk to lawyers and you obviously talk to management people, so good job. And then the translation or the integration piece is the next bit. So you're actually taking stuff from law, from management, and making something new that wasn't present in either. And so with the communication and integration, if that's happening, then that's it, you're doing it. So, and I think that I would consider you a really good example of someone interdisciplinary, because you have a background in law and you work in a management department. And so I think that we have similar histories in some sense, in that we've kind of accidentally come into management. So, yeah. I think Hannah had hers. Yeah, I know hers.
So we got
a couple over here.
3 coming up.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Claire. This is wonderful to hear about this. It strikes me as odd that medicine solved this problem with problem-based learning by going, what's the point in chemistry, anatomy, and whatever else they do, separately, when we're going to have to use them together when we need to do the thing. I don't understand why we don't bring disciplines together, like why we don't teach problem-based stuff to students at an undergraduate level. Though when I suggested it in my own school, everybody went, that's crazy, we couldn't possibly.
How's he making notes?
I've got lots. I got a to-do list.
But like, why don't we do it with research? Why are we not kind of having the sociologists there and the historians and the kind of to solve important problems that we could be bringing? Like, what's, I mean, yes, it's the funding and the era, but like we're kind of autonomous people. We could do this, couldn't we?
I mean, we can talk about how free we are another time, maybe. But I think that look, what struck me with the medical thing is that the stakes are quite high to have a problem-based situation. Very important, yeah. That's pretty high stakes, yes. But like immediately, you're like, okay, you can't just have a chemist on site. So I think that that's what immediately struck me. And I don't necessarily have the solution for you there. I think that it's just like a little bit difficult, and like we are a bit stretched and whatever, and we're kind of more focused on like other things. You know, the work that I do, I think, is all about removing trying to remove barriers, as in like if you can just kind of remove 1 or 2 barriers to doing this thing, people might do it. And so the more barriers you erect to something, just make it incrementally harder. And yes, we are autonomous, but we also have competing responsibilities and all sorts of things to do. And it's a job, and we have, you know, families and everything. And so I think that you know, because like, how is it that people, you know, in their own lives, like, how can I just like not put my washing away? It's just like that tiny barrier, like that makes it just insurmountable. And I think the same potentially applies here.
Thank you so much for the wonderful discussion. I'm Deirdre Ligita from TD School, so I've drank the Kool-Aid and, you know, might be seen as evil in some corners of the university. Just wanted to ask you more, if you could elaborate more about that idea of problem-centered organizing universities around problems, or, you know, at least university research around that, and whether, you know, that's kind of at the interface of where the real world meets the university, and then different kinds of tensions might be arising where you have, you know, academic autonomy versus some sort of interests, whose problems, what, you know, in what way they're framed, which problems we're selecting, and so on. But I wonder if you've, you know, taken the historical perspective, whether you've speculated about how it might look like, or, you know, are there any lessons to learn from the past that we could use?
Yeah, very good question. And I have a couple of examples that I can kind of draw on. The first is that we sometimes do it a little bit in the sense of ARC funding. If you're funding, say, a laureate center or a particular project, that might look like a problem. Like, it's like we are studying this thing from very different perspectives, and there is like some sort of organizing structure there around a particular problem, or, you know, a couple of research questions. And so I think that that's a really good model for how we can set up more like problem-based or like real-world challenge-based research. There are also people that have experimented with this, I think there was a transdisciplinary unit here or something. Yes, yep,
Still is.
yep, still is. And I think that one of the things that we discussed is like, how do you balance between having some structures and just like sort of letting, like, what does transdisciplinary mean, you know, and what do they do, which I think might be questions that you get sometimes. And so I think kind of going back to the communicating infrastructures and the fact that what is it that's bringing us together? Like, what is it that's putting us in the same room together? Like, is it that we are studying climate change, or that we are fixing the reef, or whatever it is? And so having like a common question will provide at least a basis for people to discuss. The challenges, because you kind of touched on that, is the ones that sort of prevent people in different disciplines talking to each other in general, which is the fact that they're talking probably a different language, at least different jargon. They're going to have different ideas about what good research is. Like, so like economists have a very different idea of that to historians, famously, and that they're probably going to have some communication breakdowns because of that. They're going to probably disagree on what they should be writing, or like what outlets they should be pitching to. Should it be going directly to government? Should it be going to this journal or that journal? And there's compromise that has to go on between that, like anyone of different backgrounds coming together. And so it's a difficult negotiation, I think.
What I heard you describe then is the or transdisciplinary sort of struggle with, I guess, in a sense. It's time consuming. And, you know, we've talked about how we might think about instructional ways of putting interdisciplinary for students. Do you think there's a missing capability gap for us as researchers and academics? And if so, how would we structure it? What would we call it? And who should be trained in it? Is it for everyone or only some people?
Yes, so I certainly think there is a capability gap, and the sort of the disciplinary structures of knowledge or of universities goes back a really long way to how we're trained as PhD students, or actually how we're trained in school, and then university instruction, and then PhD. We're like trained in a particular way of doing, even the structure of like PhD supervision. You are learning from the professor or whoever it is, and so we are there is a capability gap only in the sense that we're trained to do disciplinary knowledge, and so I think that's a good place to start, but it's not the only place to start, and I think that it requires like specialized, I suppose, training and going. And patience, I think, like of someone who is a disciplinary specialist, like being willing to go, okay, I think this is really important. I'm going to translate this in a way that's going to make sense for a sociologist or whatever it is. And so the challenge, I think, is sort of getting adequate training and making sure that people, I think, understand that this is not easy. It's not going to be effortless. It's not going to be like working with your bestie who's down the hall from you. And just, I think, reevaluating everyone's expectations around that it's not going to be the easiest thing in the world.
Look, thanks, Claire. I think we're coming to the end of our time now, so we won't take any more questions. But this has been a really fascinating discussion, I'd say, both in terms of the work that you've done, but also for the broader implications, particularly for those of us working in universities, but also for everybody, really, in terms of what knowledge can do and what the opportunities are. And the ability to retain some optimism. I'm glad that was an observation, but certainly also some really tangible things to do. So look, thank you so much for your time and reflections today, and for writing the book itself. But I will let you have the last word. So if you want to just, I don't know, sum up or comment on how you found this evening's discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Carl, and thanks for participating. It's always nice to have an in conversation like this. And thanks also to AJ for doing all of the hard labor of organising the event as well. It's been really good. It's nice to feel like these conversations are being had, and that it is something that people are interested in. So I think that it's been very valuable, and hopefully has been stimulating for at least some of you. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Thanks.
Got drinks out in the
Stay and join us for drinks and nibbles.
That's okay.
I mean, and the thing is.